So the NHS faces many challenges today: chronically weak economy, underfunded public services and a health system under severe strain. A new report, Fit for the Future, scoring the 10-year plan for the NHS, provides a forensic analysis of the government's plan, highlighting the lessons to be learned from previous reforms and the bold actions required to rebuild the NHS for the future. With us now is Mark E. Thomas, the founder of the 99% organisation and lead author of the report. Mark, hi.
Hi.
So, can you tell us first of all what exactly is the 99% organisation?
So 99% organisation is an all-volunteer organisation of about 3,700 people.
Wow.
Who would like to see our social contract in Britain recover. So what's been happening for the last 15 years or so is that people have been getting poorer. It's been getting harder and harder to make ends meet. When you get to the supermarket, it's harder to pay the bill. When you have your rent, it's harder to pay the bill. So the cost of living crisis has been getting, for many people, worse and worse year on year. And at the same time, public services have been getting weaker. And even the NHS, which is perhaps our most cherished public service, has been getting significantly weaker over the last 15 years. And we have a lot of members who are very concerned about that, some of them very expert in the NHS, and so they wrote this report.
So it's a report written by experts in the field, is that right?
Yes, it is, yes. So we've got professors, we've got senior managers in the NHS, we've got patient groups, we've got people who used to be senior clinicians in various different disciplines, all of whom are extremely concerned and all of whom have pulled their expertise.
And have the government itself been involved in the report?
The government hasn't. Some MPs have. So we have had the support from quite a few backbench MPs in the Labour Party and indeed across parties, not every party. And we've run several events in Parliament to help MPs to give them the facts and the figures that they need to argue for the right kind of positive change.
And what is it aimed to do? It's called Scoring 10-Year Plan. So it's not meant to attack, is it? It's supportive.
It's a sort of constructive view of what worked well before. The last Labour government did manage a very, very successful turnaround of the NHS, so it's very important to learn what did work then, and also if they made any mistakes then, so we don't repeat them. So we're looking at the report in the context of whether it's done those things, whether it's learning the right lessons, and therefore whether it's on track to repeat the success of the last Labour government, or whether it needs to do more to be sure of success.
And what would you say are the major points that have come up?
The biggest point really is that the last Labour government did make some mistakes, but it had the right strategy. It got three big things right. It did fund the NHS in line with need. It did tackle the causes of ill health. In particular, poverty had been rising quite sharply, and they tackled it. They reduced poverty over their term. And if you're living in poverty, then obviously you're less likely to be living in good quality housing. You're more likely to have trouble heating that housing. You're less likely to be able to afford a good diet. You're less likely to be taking regular exercise, and you're much more likely to be living with high levels of mental stress. And that's a very toxic combination. That's very bad for your health. So those causes of ill health are a huge part of what makes for a healthy population. The other big part, of course, is whether you've got a good healthcare system, and that combination is vitally important. So they funded the NHS properly. They did tackle those causes of ill health, and they also had a good prevention public health system which helped people to cut down on their drinking and smoking and have healthier diets and so on. So those were the three big things that they got right last time. And so we were hoping to see all of those three things reflected in the new plan.
And are they?
Not really. The funding is less than halfway to the kind of funding that the last Labour government provided, and it doesn't bring us up to spending what other civilized countries spend on their healthcare systems. It's very, very hard to believe that there's enough money there. It doesn't really tackle the social determinants of ill health. It talks about them, but it says, well, that's not our job, that's other government departments. And I have a little bit of sympathy with that, but on the other hand, we really need to see joined-up governments, so we needed to see more on that.
They do need to realise, as you said earlier, that it's connected.
Exactly, they're very, very connected. And they're connected the other way as well. If you let the health of the population suffer, then the economy suffers. So right now, we've got something like 3 million people of working age who have dropped out of the workforce because of ill health. And so that's about 8% of the working population. Well, the economy just simply cannot afford that. So if we're not careful, we create a vicious circle where we don't keep the population healthy, and therefore we don't have a strong economy, and then we say, well, we can't afford to keep the population healthy. And there's a big risk of that. The one area that they did talk quite a bit about was prevention, and so we welcome that. But even there were a couple of quite big omissions. There's been a huge explosion in mental health, particularly among young people, and although they mention it, they didn't appear to have done any analysis as to what the root causes are, and they didn't have any proposals to tackle the root causes of that. And we've got something like 2 million people suffering from long COVID, and the word COVID extraordinarily doesn't appear even once in the whole plan. So even on prevention, which was probably the strong point of the plan, it did have some gaps.
It's strange the way people have put COVID behind them, isn't it?
Well, it is strange, but I think it's not surprising because, people are busy, and the impression that you would get from the government and from the media is that, well, that was last year's problem.
Yeah.
But according to the Office for National Statistics, it isn't. There's something like 1.5 million people who say long COVID, the after effects of COVID, are still having a very serious effect on their lives. And of course, there could be another pandemic, and so you can't really talk about prevention without talking about pandemic prevention.
And it can't be beyond imagination that the mental health crisis was something to do with COVID.
Well, I'm sure that COVID would be part of it. It was very, very scary for people. Lots of people lost family members.
And young people were just taken out of the world for 2 years,
Yes, because we were late locking down. We had a very long lockdown. And it's almost certain, I think, that would have had an impact on people's mental health. Yeah. I live in the country, and it's not so bad here because I could get out. But if I had been living in a tower block in an inner city, I would have been like a prisoner in that tower block. And then if you're a prisoner, you run the risk of going stir crazy.
Yeah, so it's the poorest people again.
It is, definitely.
That will have suffered the most from the lockdown because they wouldn't have got out at all.
That's right, exactly. So there's that. But there are also a lot of pressures on young people that weren't really there when I was young.
Yeah.
When I was young, most people thought, well, yes, at some point I'll be able to buy my own house. They didn't think I'm going to have to be renting for the rest of my life with such a big part of my income out of my control and going to a landlord who might be a good landlord or might not be. When I went to university, I didn't have to pay student fees. I actually got a grant. So I effectively paid to go to university.
And you didn't think that you would have to stay with your family forever. In fact,
exactly.
You didn't want to. You wouldn't be. You never expected to be dependent on your family the way even quite well-off kids are nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. And this whole thing about the bank of mum and dad, which is, I think it's bad for everybody, as you say. It's even bad for well-off kids to be dependent, and we weren't. But it's much worse if there isn't really a bank of mum and dad, and in a very difficult situation. Jobs are harder to get. When you do get them, they're not so well paid. The terms and conditions aren't so good. 40 years ago, pensions were a thing with most reasonable jobs. You got a reasonable pension. Now, very, very few jobs offer a reasonable pension.
Yeah.
So there are enormous pressures financially and otherwise, and at the same time, I think expectations are very high with social media effectively saying, unless you're living the dream and you look like a supermodel, or if you're a man, you've got a six-pack, then there's something wrong with you. all of that pressure wasn't there. Maybe we worked hard, but we had a lot more freedom and a lot less pressure.
I suppose if you're going to compare it to what the last Labour government did, you also can't expect to apply old solutions to new problems.
No, I think that's right. There are some new problems that the last Labour government didn't have to deal with, and indeed the whole country wasn't as run down in 1997 as it is today. So this government has got a much bigger challenge than the Blair government had in 1997. On the other hand, it's not as big a challenge as the Attlee government had in 1946, if you imagine that. After 6 years of war, obviously lots of people had been killed, lots of factories had been destroyed. The ones that weren't destroyed had been put across to the war effort, so they were making things that suddenly nobody wanted. And we had a ratio of debt to GDP which was over 250% at the end of the Second World War. So that's more than 2.5 times higher than it is today. So it's not impossible to deal with these tremendously difficult situations, but it does require bold solutions.
Yeah, and really, as you've been saying throughout, really joined up thinking, not just looking at the NHS as a standalone issue.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's impossible for the Department of Health and Social Care to fix everything all on its own. You can't have a broken country and somehow the NHS is going to pick up the pieces.
No.
It does have to be joined up thinking.
Well, I've just seen that the presentation of the report has been delayed.
It has, unfortunately. It was going to be tomorrow in Parliament. It will, I hope, be in October. So it's not a huge delay, but it is a delay. And the sooner we can get the messages across, the better, obviously.
And let's hope they listen. Thanks for talking to us. It's been really interesting.